So in October of 2009, current President Barack Obama signed the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act, which expands the 1969 U.S. federal hate crime law to include crimes motivated by a victim's actual or perceived gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, or disability. The bill also requires that the FBI track statistics, hate crime statistics, provides more funding to help state and local agencies pay for investigating and prosecuting hate crimes, as well as gives federal authorities the greater ability to engage in hate crime investigations that local authorities choose not to pursue. Okay, so that act looks great on paper, even greater in concept, but what are your thoughts on why hate crime laws are difficult to try in court? For example, obviously with Trayvon Martin, or even in March, the difficulties when former student Darun Ravi was convicted of bias intimidation.
Okay, so actually, if I have a whole PowerPoint about hate crimes law and how flawed they are, but I'm not gonna subject you to it. But I just kind of want you to get a sense of just how hate crimes work in California. It's California Penal Code 422.55. It defines what a hate crime is. It has two elements. One is a criminal act, and secondly, the criminal act has to have been committed in whole or in part because a perceived or actual characteristic of the victim. That's a covered characteristic such as disability, gender, nationality, sexual orientation, race, religion. So what's interesting to point out about that is that it's not, the hate crime itself is not the crime, it's an enhancement to an existing crime. So if you beat someone up and the reason you did it is because of race and it's provable that it wasn't just in your head, but there's some external way of proving that you did it because of race, that's where you would receive that enhancement. And it is very difficult to prove because it is based on your state of mind, and sometimes you don't have things, people won't actually vocally say why they're doing what they're doing, they're just physically doing it, and that's why it is very hard to prosecute a hate crimes law. And again, going back to our critique of the criminal justice system, the vast majority of people who are in our criminal justice system are people of color, African Americans, Latinos, and also Southeast Asians and other Asian communities. And the hate crimes laws are actually often used against minority perpetrators and not so much white perpetrators, particularly in our juvenile systems where there are a lot of minority on minority crimes. In cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco, oftentimes hate crimes are perpetrated minority on minority. And I want to just draw us back to a few years ago where there were several cases of African American on Asian hate crime, and that really galvanized the community, but still very unresolved as to how we're dealing with these types of issues. We can't use the traditional lens of a white perpetrator against a minority victim. And a critique of the Matthew Shepard hate crimes law, when it was being developed, I didn't like personally how much it reinforced our criminal system, and at one point there was discussion about including the death penalty in the Matthew Shepard's hate crime law, and I think that part of when we develop this hate crimes law and our civil rights law, we need to also think about criminal justice reform and work with our African American sisters and brothers to talk about how we're reinforcing a already broken system.
You know, I think that hate crimes becomes a shorthand way for talking about the race consciousness that undergirds a lot of criminal activity. But it is insufficient shorthand. One of the challenges of Vincent Chin was not just that it was a hate crime, but it was disparate treatment under the law. Right? And so it wasn't so much like, okay, you know, we're pushing for the perpetrators here to receive additional punishment, but an acknowledgement that Vincent Chin as a victim was not receiving equal treatment. Right? What happens, and Angela, I think, you know, has done a lot of work on this, but the overall criminal justice system has become warped, and institutional is extremely racist. And with hate crimes, it's become an opportunity for a lot of the proponents of that hypercriminalization to add on even more, right? Both in terms of additional sentencing that's draining away resources from our schools, quite literally, in California. So I think and what we found, and this is very germane to what's happening in San Francisco and in the Bay Area, that the large number and the growing Asian American population changes our understanding of what it means to be part of the oppressed. That as much as we still are victims in many ways we are now also part of the class that has power and privilege and abuses that power and privilege. that the African American population, as one example in San Francisco, is much, much smaller. And in neighborhoods along the southeast sector of San Francisco, you have crimes that are happening that are not hate crimes in the way we think of them, that they're not motivated by people hate African Americans, so they're committing crimes, or they hate Asian Americans and they're committing crimes. But there are crimes that are happening, and all of a sudden there are racial implications and consequences that many folks don't know how to deal with, right? And I think that that's one of the challenges as we think about not just hate crimes, but how do we understand, these incidents in a whole new paradigm. I think Vincent Chin lifted up that it was no longer a black-white paradigm, but I think we haven't figured out, well, how do we work on many of these issues in even more multiracial paradigm, where the perpetrators are not white.
Just following up on what Vince mentioned there, we all know that there are a lot of Asian Americans in the Bay Area. When we do a lot of work, obviously, in schools, in K through 12 schools, and there are certain schools in the Bay Area and in Southern California as well that are certainly majority Asian American. Here in San Francisco, the first one that comes to mind is Lowell High School, but there are other schools, Mission San Jose and Fremont. There's Monte Vista down in Cupertino. And I remember hearing a couple students at Mission San Jose say to me, well, at Mission San Jose, it's cooler to be Asian. And I thought to myself, well, what does that mean if you're not Asian, right? I also think, I recently heard a story on NPR about there's a burgeoning population of African immigrants in southern China, particularly in Guangdong province. And there was a story about, I think he may have been a Nigerian merchant who, as is customary in China, to carry around a whole lot of cash. And he was meeting someone for a business meeting, or what he thought was a business meeting, and a whole bunch of local Chinese thugs beat him and really severely injured him and stole all of his money. And first of all, I felt a great amount of shame, not that I was there, being part of this crew that beat this man, but what it told me is that this is really just human nature, it seems, to prey on those who are most vulnerable. And so it just made me think that, as we do all of the work that we do, fighting for the rights of Asian Americans, fighting for the rights of other oppressed communities, we just have to remember that in some places, in some corners of this country, in some corners of other country, people that look like each and every one of us are the perpetrators. And so what does that mean for the work that we do?
I think the only thing that I would add is actually taking a step back from hate crimes and looking at hate incidents and bullying, incidents that don't rise to the level of a crime. And quite often, the challenge that we see with both those and hate crimes is that our communities aren't stepping forward. So as much as there are problems in the criminal justice system, as much as prosecutors don't want to charge hate crimes because they're difficult to win, how many times in our community has someone how many times have we been called slurs and not said anything about it? There was a story several months ago out of San Diego where an Iraqi woman was found dead in her home, and the initial allegations were that it was a hate crime, and we don't know to this day whether it was a hate crime or domestic violence or what. But the actual murder aside, what surfaced was that she had in the past received notes, hateful notes targeting her, telling her to go back to her country and things of that sort, and hadn't told anyone. I mean, she had told her family, but she hadn't reported it to law enforcement. There wasn't any record of it. She hadn't reported it to advocacy groups, and so no one was doing community building work in those sectors, right? No one was having conversations about where does a hate crime come from? I mean, I have a hard time understanding that someone ordinary with no hate in their heart wakes up one day and decides to go kill someone. It starts before that. It starts with inclinations of hate. It starts with racial slurs, and it escalates to criminal acts. And so I would say that we need to take control of this and start having these conversations and not burying our experiences in shame or in silence or for fear of worrying others. Let's talk about what's actually happening when it happens, before it happens.
Do you want to reply?
No, I want to just thank you for bringing up the context around hate incidents. Right? Because I think that if we just look at our schools, the problem of bullying and harassment or hazing has been part of the American educational culture for a long, long, long time. It's only beginning to get some attention. I think we understand it oftentimes now in the context of harassment and bullying of LGBT students who are coming out or even perceived to be different in some ways, right? And I think we have to lean into this. We have to lean into this as a way that we can start talking about how people considered the other, people considered somehow alien, are treated, right? And I think it's oftentimes much harder to look at within ourselves and understand the prejudices that we put onto others than it is to talk about the discrimination or the bias that we feel. But I think those conversations have to happen at the same time. One small example, we run a parents association in San Francisco of mostly immigrant parents. And we are able to talk about bullying and harassment because they worry about their children being taunted. But we never stop at, okay, well, how do we help your child? But to understand, the broader context of other groups and other people who are also mistreated. Right? And so I think in all of our work, that starts off from, okay, something's, there's been a wrong committed, I feel wrong, I want justice. It has to always have that next step of getting to that sense that we do see historically, and even in a lot of the beautiful narratives and the litanies of getting to that place where it is something about justice for all people, right? And I think the bullying and the hate incidents are maybe sometimes a more powerful way of doing that than just looking at the so-called legal definition of hate crimes.
Thank you. So we'll go back to exploring bullying in a bit, but I wanted to address, before Zara has to go, I wanted to address how San Francisco has recently passed the San Francisco SAFE, I believe it's what it's called. Can you tell us how that came about and the story behind it and what it means for San Francisco and nationwide possibly?
Sure. So I think that the story of the Safe San Francisco Civil Rights Ordinance drives home a point that Angela made about not reinforcing the broken criminal justice system and holding our police accountable. And so a couple of years ago, Police Chief George Gascon, interestingly of, I believe, Cuban descent, made some incredibly racist remarks at a breakfast where they were raising money for some ballot proposition around earthquake safety for buildings. And he said, and I'm paraphrasing because there weren't any reporters there, but it was reported to us that he said, "The Hall of Justice is as much at risk of an earthquake as it is at risk of someone of Middle Eastern descent parking a van in front of it and blowing it up." This is the highest ranking law enforcement agent in the city of San Francisco at the time. He is now he is the district attorney for the city of San Francisco. When asked to clarify, well, what do you mean Middle Eastern members of our community? He said, oh, no, the Yemenis and the Afghans, because that's where terrorism is coming from. And it sparked a movement, I think, that started within the Arab, Muslim, and South Asian segments of the San Francisco community. Immediately, people who had not been engaged in the political process, people who had not been participating in community organizing, mobilized really quickly. And so within just a couple of days, there was a community meeting that was attended by dozens of people. Chief George Gascon was forced to meet with the community multiple times and then forced to apologize to a congregation of several thousand Yemenis in San Francisco. But what it said to us was, this is just the start, right? Like, if this is what he's talking about, what are the policies that he's putting into practice? What are the police officers that report to him doing when they interact with people who are of Arab, Middle Eastern, or South Asian descent? And so through the work of the Asian Law Caucus and the ACLU, we were able to submit several Public Records Act requests to learn more about the racial profiling policies within the San Francisco Police Department, to learn more about the way the San Francisco Police Department was working with the FBI, who we know for the most part has shredded the Constitution over the last 10 years. And I say that with all due respect for what they do to protect our country, but has shredded the Constitution over the last 10 years, 12 now. And it's been an ongoing process, and so sometimes change starts locally. A lot of times when we talk about these things that happen in Detroit or in DC, it feels so far away, and I'm just one person in San Francisco. What can I do? And so for us, it was important as a community to come together and say, all right, we can't control what the FBI does. We can't control what's happening in DC, but we can put our foot down and say, our San Francisco tax dollars are not going to pay for racial profiling. Our San Francisco tax dollars are going to pay for law enforcement that protects us, not that profiles us. And so It took 2.5 years nearly, but just last month, Mayor Ed Lee signed the Safe San Francisco Civil Rights Ordinance, which essentially says that San Francisco police officers cannot be violating the California Constitution. It seems pretty straightforward, but it took 2.5 years to get there. That they cannot be using First Amendment protected activities to profile members of our community, and that they cannot be cooperating with the FBI if it means racial profiling. And any and all interactions that they have with the FBI should be documented, should be approved, should be pursuant to local policies, and should be reported on to the Board of Supervisors, because it doesn't make sense that our police are acting in secret to target specific segments of our community. That doesn't make us any safer.